There's a lot of talk about the red flag law here in America, and Charleston County Sheriff Al Cannon is weighing in exclusively on Quintin's Close-Ups. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. Listen to this interview Tuesday on my free Quintin's Close-Ups iHeartRadio podcast. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Sheriff Al Cannon, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Quintin, it's been a while, but I think I was one of you first.
Many years ago, 7 years ago, that's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And now I got a phone call, actually email just recently saying that you wanted to talk to me about the red flag laws.
Well, there's a lot of concern and discussion about that. And I thought you were one of the first people I thought of in terms of sitting down and being able to have a discussion about that. My concern is, and it always is that something bad happens and then people in reaction to that understandably upset. But in the midst of emotion or anger, my experience has been you make a decision then, and it's oftentimes a wrong decision. Important decisions should be made when you can sit down and rationally discuss, objectively discuss issues, and this is certainly one of those. It's a little more complicated than just pass this law or pass that law. Of course, the sheriff's office is very much involved in mental health related issues because as the enforcement arm for the courts, that includes probate courts, where folks can go to say, listen, I have a loved one who, because of mental health issues or substance abuse issues, is a threat to themselves or a threat to others. And if the judge feels like and it's a different standard, it's certainly not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but if the judge feels that threshold has been met, then he can issue or she can issue an emergency pickup order. And that comes to the sheriff's office, and we have a special team that is trained to go out and pick these individuals up, transport them to medical facilities to be examined by competent psychiatric health professionals. And then depending on that outcome, we may take them back home. If the individual has been determined not to be a threat to themselves or others, we can take them for a voluntary commitment, or we can take them to an involuntary commitment. If the doctor feels enough that they're a threat to themselves or others, and the person does not want to go on their own, then the doctor's in a position to commit that individual, in effect, against their will. Usually for a fairly brief period, it just gives mental health professionals a little bit more time to study an individual, find a medication that might work in their particular case. So that's how that process works. Now, the red flag laws that have been discussed, as I understand it, would come into play with this group of individuals. In the first place, mental health has been a very challenging area for law enforcement. There's been a great deal of discussion in terms of being able to de-escalate out there on the streets when we come into contact with someone who's in the midst of emotional or mental crisis. That's a huge issue. And there has been considerable training devoted to that, crisis intervention training and those sorts of things. Some of the challenges as it relates to mental health is the stigma that's attached to that. People, for example, a family member, a wife, or a mother feels like something's going on with their loved one, and they're afraid for them or about them. It's very tough to get someone to come in and seek help on behalf of their loved one, because they're thinking, if I do that, he's going to lose his job, or he might not get that new job, or we might not get that loan for the house that we're seeking. All sorts of little things that come into people's minds that worries them about what will happen if they come forward to report someone suffering from mental illness. Now, I will tell you, there are millions upon millions of Americans who at any given time have some kind of mental condition that warrants them being on medication and are on medication. To say, to speak about mental health and people who are suffering from some emotional illness, we ought to keep the guns out of the hands of the sick or the mentally ill or the crazy, as I've heard some people say. For us who deal with mental health, I think personally, and this is my opinion, there's a little bit of a setback as it relates to trying to destigmatize what is a serious issue throughout the country, particularly when you consider how many people are being seen by mental health professionals out there. And by the way, being a threat to themselves may be nothing more than an elderly person who is living alone, who is not able to take care of themselves as it relates to paying their bills or getting food, for a whole host of things of that sort, the kind of things that people don't generally think of when they hear threat to themselves or others. They think in suicide or homicide, and it's a much more complex issue than just those two situations.
Let me back all that up.
All right.
You talked earlier about conversations that you're having about the red flag laws. What type of conversations are you having here within the Charleston County Sheriff's Office?
That's a good question. I don't know that we're having, and this represents my opinion,
Sure.
and should not be accepted as being anyone else's. But I believe, for example, police officers who really sit and think about these issues will have a similar feeling. And I'll give you a perfect example.
Okay.
After Sandy Hook and the killing of all of the elementary school first grade students up in Connecticut, Senator Feinstein went to reintroduce the assault weapons ban. I happened to watch one of the Sunday programs, and they had the commissioner of the New York City Police Department on there. And the host asked the commissioner, what do you think about this assault weapons bill that Senator Feinstein is trying to bring back? And he said, well, I have a great deal of respect for the senator and what she's attempting to do, but honestly, our problem is not with assault weapons, it's with handguns. Which leads us to another issue, and that is this. For a whole host of obvious reasons, we get really upset when something like El Paso or Dayton happen. That is something that jars the consciousness and just is something thrown in our face that we just have a hard time grasping. Okay? And then there's the gun violence that is endemic in some of our large cities in particular. Those are not the same thing. These individuals, and the definition for a mass shooting is, depending on who you hear, 4 or more individuals shot or killed in one incident. You may have a whole host of those that happen over in the sector of what would, gun violence in inner cities, oftentimes involving minorities. Comparing the two, though, are two different things. You're not talking about generally mental health issues here. You're talking about lifestyle decisions. You're talking about drug-related. You're talking about payback for real or perceived slights, all sorts of things that come into play in that setting. And I think it's important to keep those two separate. Red flag laws aren't going to do anything to stop the murders and the shootings in Chicago or Baltimore, okay? Mental health is not so much an issue there. These are lifestyle situations. They are turf type battles. They are related to drugs, whole host of things. Those folks are not, generally speaking, going to be impacted by laws that you pass. They are going to find a weapon. They're either stolen or they're bought on a black market. We have seen indications in the last decade, I'd say, of guns being passed around among the street, like in being rented or loaned around and used in different kinds of criminal activity. Laws that we have on the books, which, by the way, in many instances aren't being prosecuted, these folks are not paying any attention to whatsoever. Let me tell you the kind that aren't being prosecuted. In the state of South Carolina, there is an additional separate charge and sentence for using the firearm in the commission of a violent act. In state court, more often than not, and that's all over the country, those get pled down to something else. They are part of plea bargaining because courts, particularly state courts, are so overwhelmed in numbers that they've got to make decisions on cases that they're not going to pursue in court. They're going to accept a plea bargain, okay? And so that extra charge gets pled away and is not used the way the law has been written. That was to, the intent there was to penalize someone who is exactly the person who needs to be penalized, someone who is using a firearm in the commission of violent crime. Same thing on the federal level as it relates to people go to and this is something that's misunderstood. There are auction houses online.
Sure.
So you can purchase a gun from a different state, but when you purchase it, they're going to be sending it either through their federal firearms licensed dealer, but they're going to be sending it one that I designate or that the buyer designates in his hometown. So it doesn't come to him. He's got to go, the firearms dealer will process that gun into his inventory for a brief period of time, so it goes on records and it complies with the laws, federal laws. He then turns around and the person who won that firearm on an auction goes in, provides his identification, which is run through the national background check, and it's as if that purchase was being made from a local dealer. It's not something that's sent by the person who sells the gun to the person who buys it. It's got to go through that route. So that's a misconception I think a lot of people have.
And let me back up again because You talk about definitions. How do you define the red flag law now?
I'm not sure that we really have anything like that in place, but from what I gather, and I'm not sure that there's necessarily a single definition when people say that's, when they talk about that, but it involves an individual who has been, actually there are two trains of thought. One is that has been adjudicated, that is, there's a due process where they go through and a judge has found that there's sufficient evidence to believe, and he takes whatever the mental health diagnosis is and says you've been found to be that, or a less than due process where without evidence and trials and juries, they make a decision based on what doctors say and things like that. The due process approach means that an individual has notice and can bring an attorney to represent his interests when a determination is being made as to whether or not he is meets the criteria for being designated a threat to themselves or others. The other is more of a medical approach based on medical examination and that sort of thing. But it's not the same kind of due process. So it depends on, and I've heard people say that they supported red flag laws in both regards.
Sure.
And I think that's problematic. Early on, after the events of 2001, and we went into Afghanistan and Iraq, some period of time as people started coming back with injuries and PTSD, we started recognizing that was a real and serious issue facing folks who had been in combat and they came back. There was an instance where the VA started looking at people with PTSD and taking the position they were going to automatically take their weapons away from them. Well, that didn't last very long. The veterans said, we go over here and we fight, and then we come back and we've got this PTSD, and you're going to take all our weapons away. And so they backed off of that. Mental health is not something that necessarily everybody agrees with in terms of the kind of diagnosis that a doctor may come up with. But in any event, that red flag law is one of the popular things that's being discussed, as is the reinstituting the assault weapons ban. Now, historically, with that legislation, it has been pretty challenging to define just what is an assault weapon. But the bigger issue is this. Let's say that we ban the sale of assault weapons. What happens to the millions of assault weapons that are still out there? And already we see people, and this is what makes people who are really strong on the Second Amendment, this is what makes them fearful. You've already got people out there talking because they recognize that just stopping and banning assault weapons does nothing to address the millions that are out there in the community. So now some of them will start talking about a buyback program like they had in Australia. And then after some period, that amnesty period, if you will, people can sell them back to the government. There'd be a cutoff date, and they'd say, okay, if you've not turned in your semi-automatic rifles by this time, you're now going to be in violation of a crime of having possession of an assault weapon or semi-automatic weapon. That's going to create, I would predict, a lot of people in this country who feel very strongly about their firearms. There are about 14 million hunting licenses issued every year. There are well over 300 million firearms. Nobody knows how many firearms there are out there. Now, how do you go about determining that? There's not a list or a registration in most places as it relates to firearms. In some states that are very strict, if you're going to get a permit to carry a firearm, you got to tell them all about that firearm, to include the serial number. But if you've got a whole bunch of guns at home, you're not required to do that. So they may know about the one, but they're not going to know about the other. So how do you go about doing it? And I think that will cause tremendous problems throughout the country from people who do not feel that they should have to give up their firearms.
What would be an ideal red flag law in your mind?
Well, let's go back and look at something else, and I'm gonna answer that. There's been nothing that I've seen from El Paso or Dayton to suggest that mental health is an issue there. Okay, that's what red flags deal with. Ideology does not make, if you kill based on your warped view of the world, that's not the same as saying that you're mentally ill such that that could have been recognized and acted on beforehand. Dayton, again, not a mental health type issue. An individual had drugs in his system, but we don't know very much about him at this point. And even this one in Las Vegas, one of the worst shootings in the world, law enforcement, from everything I've been able to read, does not have any idea what motivated that individual to do what he did. That one is very challenging in no uncertain terms, in terms of trying to find what went on there, what prompted him to do that. The San Bernardino Christmas shooting, that was ideology again. In that case, it was in support of Muslim terrorists. So it's hard, you go all the way back to Columbine.
Sure.
Those kids, nothing that I've read about that indicates that they were suffering from any kind of mental illness. So mental illness and mass shootings, you got the shooting at the theater in Aurora. Right. That's one that would appear to be mental health related issues there. You remember, he was in medical school. They noticed some things that were very troubling there. He dropped out of medical school. They said, okay, he's gone. We don't have to worry about him anymore. And then, of course, that information wasn't passed on. Big problem is, and we're facing this with respect to opioid. In a lot of respects, although HIPAA laws protect people's privacy, it is actually a hindrance when it comes to trying to help people with opioid problems. Let's say you have a person that overdoses on opioids out there, and EMS and the police arrive, okay? They revive the individual, bring him back, give him the Narcan, all right? So, but you can't give a group over here that has the wherewithal to go follow up with that individual, to try to convince them to get services, or to get in touch with their family, to convince the families to get them in service like that. You can't readily exchange that information, give them information about an individual who has overdosed and who was saved from death by giving them. So there are all kinds of laws. When you start talking about mental health or medical issues, now you've got hindrances on how much of that information you can share. Those things would have to be addressed when it comes to mental health people. Say you got an individual you feel that way, that is a threat to themselves or others, and can you broadcast much about that individual? There are a lot of questions that come into play on issues like that, where you have to depend on having information to protect officers. Or here's another point: we have people who are adequately trained to interact with people suffering from mental health issues. When they get that order, they go pick that person up. They are very adept at being able to do that, and they do that without a lot of problems. What happens now, you're going to tie the weapons to it. And this individual who has some mental issues, but is an avid hunter, or someone else that has a number of weapons. Now, you're going to go to his house. We would generally send a couple people from that unit there. But by definition, this is a person who's been found to be a threat, right? So now maybe we got to take the SWAT team to go in there with him, because we know he's got weapons coming from his relatives, or whatever the case may be. That may be another factor that enters into the decision as to whether or not a person seeks psychiatric care, or his family goes to get him or her psychiatric care. Here's another situation.
Okay.
You got an avid hunter, okay, and his wife is diagnosed. They don't come in and take the hunter's weapons. See, that's a challenge. His wife, he says, hey, that's got nothing to do with me. I'm not suffering from any illness. I'm not a threat to anybody, myself or otherwise. And she is got a problem, but there's nothing to indicate and suggest that she's going to do anything with any gun. Now, you're going to come take my guns? And I've got a lot of money invested in these guns. What kind of condition they're going to be in when you get them back?
Let me get to the other side. If you were to talk to somebody on the other side and they ask you, would these red flag laws stop Emmanuel, Aurora, Columbine? What would you say?
It might have stopped Aurora, but here's the problem, but not the other two, because I think those were ideology driven, which does not equate to mental illness. Aurora, here's the problem. That guy was pretty committed. However, whatever mental illness he had, he was pretty committed, all right? This is one of the other problems. Now you're getting over here to where this other situation, because if a person wants a gun and they're doing drugs, this individual from Emmanuel is an example. People talk about the Charleston loophole, but even if he went to a gun store to buy a gun and they say you can't buy a gun, he's doing cocaine. He's out there in an environment where it's no big deal to say, man, I'm looking for a handgun. Can you help me get that? You know, they're on the streets. And people who are doing drugs are interacting with the people who have access to guns as well, because guns and drugs go hand in hand. They are totally related. So to think that if they had made that 10 days and had caught that individual is not the same to say that they would have prevented the shooting, because he was a pretty committed guy. He came down here, he studied. He didn't choose that location by accident. He chose that after studying and looking at all kinds of things, made trips down here, prepared himself for it. He was pretty committed. And that's one of the things, Quintin, that comes into play here. Something bad happens, and we tend to look at that incident through our eyes instead of through the eyes of others. And what we generally do, whether it's drugs, firearms, or any other illegal substance, we totally underestimate the creativity of people in finding what they need, or we underestimate their level of commitment. Now let's say we do away with assault weapons, extra magazine, large count magazines. Say we get it down to 10 or 7. What you can have then is somebody who, with 2 handguns and a book bag full of magazines with 7 rounds in it, what they may then do is look for an easier target where they're not likely to have anybody confront, and they're able to do what they want to do, changing magazines as they go. And that's where people looking at it through their eyes and think, well, that would certainly stop me, is not realistic when you're thinking about the individual who has a mind to do something like that.
Let me get back to what you just said about the Charleston loophole. Where are you with that 4 years later?
Well, there has been an effort, I think, on the federal level and the state level to address that issue. There are some people who say we need to have people wait 10 days or 21 days, whatever the case may be, a longer term, because they figure that piece being overlooked or incorrectly entered in that particular case would have been found out. I don't think that's necessarily true, but in any event, that's the argument, that if you had a longer waiting period, you'd be able to discover more about an individual. All I'm saying is that's not his only or her only access to firearms. The little lady down at the school here, right? She's got mental issues apparently, and she's out on the streets looking for drugs or whatever the case may be. I'm telling you, that puts an individual in the environment where if they want a handgun, they're going to be able to get a handgun. So, the idea that somehow or another we close that gun dealer door, that's going to solve the problem, is unrealistic in the context of the level of creativity and commitment these folks have. They don't just shrug their shoulders and say, well, can't do it.
Sheriff Al Quintin, thank you so much for the 60-minute special.
Yeah.
I think that went on for like an hour. But thank you for your time, and welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
I appreciate that. And what you're thinking about what I did?
No, I can't comment on that.
Oh, yeah, okay. Cut it off.